Okay, welcome to your webinar. We're going to get started now since we're at the top of the hour. My name is Joe Walsh. I'm a client partner for Earley Information Science. I'm pleased to be a part of today's session. We just got word that we're down a man. Seth Earley, our founder and CEO, is out ill. We'll trust he will recover rapidly, but we're going to carry on here. So I'm going to quickly introduce Eli Cooley, or allow him to introduce himself, and then we'll proceed with the webinar. Say hello, Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli Cooley. I'm a senior consultant with Earley Information Science. I've been working with Earley for about 9 years now, and I've been in the product information space for almost 20 years, about 18 years. Seth Earley did ask us to mention that he has not missed a webinar in 25 years, so he's sorry he couldn't be here.
Yeah. We'll do this justice, Seth, I promise. And I'll just add a little note to my bio. I've been in and around the product data services and software market for most of my life. In fact, I can think back to the days when we would index paper catalogs on CD-ROM. So I've given away my age a bit there. But I am always invested in helping people become good stewards of product data. So hopefully this is one more step in that process for me and everybody else. A few housekeeping notes before we proceed. We are recording this webinar, so we'll make sure that folks that are in attendance get a link to that when they are back in their seats in a few days. We plan to go about an hour. We'll budget some time for some Q&A. We do appreciate input. Therefore, we're going to run a couple polls. We'll try and wake your brains up a little bit, and maybe you can see where you stack up with some of your peers on this webinar relative to the contents of today. We do want to thank our media partners, CMS Wire and Marketing AI Institute. If you haven't already visited their websites, I encourage you to do so. Lots of great content for those that are trying to keep up with the trends in the market around content and data and information architecture and AI. Now, in terms of our agenda today, we're going to cover a lot of material, and we'll focus in on product data specifically. And what we recognize is that there are a lot of organizations that have product data programs internally, and that's not an easy thing to lift and sustain. We recognize that product data is always changing. Therefore, teams have to adapt. So we're going to talk about what some of those typical challenges are in a business. PIM software is a household acronym now. Most enterprises are aware of it or using it, and have to organize their business around it. And there's enough data that has been returned to us that tells us what the limitations are of PIM software. So we want to touch on that and maybe counsel folks on how they can avoid or skirt around some of those limitations. Spreadsheets and more spreadsheets. We can't get away from spreadsheets, can we? Can't live with them, can't live without them, or maybe you can. We'll divulge into that a little bit as well. And then we're introducing maybe a new buzzword in the industry called Pre-PIM. We don't know yet, but we're going to dive into an application that we use to help our customers onboard optimized data into their PIM software applications. So we'll give you some kind of detailed looks into what that looks like and some use cases around that may be applicable to your business. And then finally, we'll give you a couple of good ideas to maybe jump in the pool if you're thinking about improving your product data team, if you're thinking about applying software to some data problems. We have some good ideas around that. A quick commercial on Earley Information Science. We are not newcomers to the world of data and information architecture. I tell people that we build information architectures for the digital enterprise. And what that means is we're applying years and years and years of proven methodologies to organize information and data that ultimately helps companies sell more product, or service their customers better, and innovate faster. And as you can see, we've worked with some of the industry's leading organizations in the market. So we're very proud of our work to date. Now, I told you we'd wake up your brains. Here's our first poll. So get ready. where are you on your product information management journey? You have 5 options there, and we hope that you'll participate, and maybe it's a chance for you to, again, size up where you are relative to others that are in this session today. And we'll give folks about 30 seconds to do this. Eli, if you were a betting man, I'm not accusing you of being one, but where do you think folks would line up?
That depends who's on the call, but I'm going to guess number 3.
Okay. I'm going to go with number 1. Okay, let's see if results are coming in. I don't see any yet. Maybe our host, Sharon, who's helping us on the sidelines, has something for us. Okay, I see some results here. So it looks like the winner was number 3. We have implemented PIM, but have challenges. Okay, that's not uncommon. Coming in a close second, we are in the planning stages for PIM. Coming in third, none of the above. That's about right. I think if you have none of the above challenges, perhaps you're doing really, really well as well. So that's some good feedback. Folks are weighing in, and there's a smattering of responses there. Now, moving on to the meat of the session, I'm going to transition to Eli. And Eli, you can talk about some of the typical challenges that you're seeing when talking to folks that are wrestling with product data.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's interesting that it sounds like on this call, in terms of the people watching here, we have some people who have already implemented PIM, and we have some people who are in the process of implementing, and maybe some people who aren't using off-the-shelf PIMs at all. It's hard to speak generally about all the PIMs because there's so many of them out there. There's kind of the market leaders, and then there's a whole slew of kind of newcomers to the space. So it's hard to generalize, but one thing that we know for sure is that almost every PIM that we've worked with, and we've worked with all of them, has challenges in getting the data loaded to the PIM. And that's what we're talking here today about is pre-PIM. So it's the process of loading data to PIM pretty much for the first time. That's what we're primarily talking about. But of course, there's ongoing loads to PIM. Maybe if you acquire a company, or you bring on a new supplier, there's many use cases for loading data to PIM once the PIM is already implemented. But we're primarily focused here today about on the activities that occur prior to loading data to PIM the first time, when you're implementing PIM the first time. And those challenges include data modeling. So you need to get the data model, or determine what the data model is going to be, before you can even configure and set up your PIM. So that's a typical challenge. Also, pilot data. So fast tracking one set of data, a smaller set of data, so that we can test the PIM and test PIM syndication. Third is taxonomy design. So almost every PIM requires a taxonomy design, or maybe even multiple taxonomy designs, and possibly complex mappings between those taxonomies and rules between the taxonomies. Stakeholder review and approval is important. So usually we want to take a look at the data before it gets loaded to PIM, and we want to have key stakeholders sign off on it. And that's a common challenge. Data quality and remediation. Oftentimes we're not looking to just load whatever we had in our legacy systems. We're looking to actually take an opportunity to improve the data quality and remediate data normalization and other issues with the content before we load it to PIM. The last two are measuring impact. So getting our hands on metrics that help us understand what has occurred during a data transformation, or during what has happened from the picture of our legacy data to our initial state in PIM. And then lastly, governance and change management. So setting up rules and understanding what the workflows are going to look like, but also having what we sometimes call governance content in place, which would be style guidelines, controlled vocabularies or term dictionaries, and building those out so that they're ready to go when the PIM is implemented.
So a lot of challenges there, and let's see if we can peel the layers a little more here. So I've advanced the slide, and we're going to actually portray a diagram of a PIM system inside a business. And as you can see, PIM is quite a weighty application, and it's responsible for a lot of processes inside a business. You can see on the left side, the data sources that it connects to, and some of these data sources may be outside your purview or control. So a lot of responsibility there. Data comes in. You have people that are assigned to the system to conduct certain roles and make sure that product data kind of moves through a process where it gets to a state where you have confidence in publishing it to external channels. So a lot of responsibility on a system for an enterprise that, where product data is essentially the name of the game, and good product data. Eli, what would you add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty good high-level picture, a generic picture of PIM. We see PIM adoption is increasing every year. Some of the market laggards still have homegrown PIMs. Many of the market leaders still have homegrown PIMs. But that middle section of everybody else in the middle is growing every year, and I would say it's reached a tipping point now where most of the organizations we work with are either implementing or have already implemented a commercial PIM.
I would agree. And if you think about sort of in the traditional sense, how data gets into a PIM system, it kind of looks like this. Folks are still very reliant on a spreadsheet-driven process. And what we're starting to figure out is, maybe there's some better ways. Maybe there's some more efficient ways. Maybe there's some more ways that you can put better confidence into what you're putting into the PIM system, so you're not churning out data that you don't have a lot of confidence in when it goes to market. Eli, I know you have some thoughts on that because you've been deeply involved in, our pre-PIM application.
Yeah, if you advance just one more, I think it completes the picture. Yeah, so you have all these sources that we're drawing from when we're loading data to PIM, and a lot of times those are files or they're spreadsheets. They're coming out of an ERP. They're coming out of maybe a legacy homegrown PIM. They're coming from supplier files. Maybe those are Excel files or CSV files. And if we look at the most common methodologies for loading data to PIM today, it's still a lot of spreadsheets. So it's a series of spreadsheets that are required for data load. And these are, there's a spreadsheet for the master attributes. There's a spreadsheet for the attributes related to the categories. There's a spreadsheet for the taxonomy. There's a spreadsheet for all of the products. There's a spreadsheet for all of the SKUs. And there's linkages between all of these. So there's the spreadsheet that links the products to the categories, and the spreadsheet that links the items to the products. It's a spreadsheet that links the attributes to the categories. So there's a lot of spreadsheets going around, and it becomes very difficult to manage. We see a lot of our clients, struggling in this kind of pre-PIM phase, where they have all this data that they're trying to line up before they load it to PIM. And they're managing it in spreadsheets, or maybe they've constructed a SQL database or an Access database, and they're struggling to keep all of these linkages aligned. They're struggling to get everyone to review and approve, bring in all the subject matter experts and key stakeholders who need to review sections of the content. And we see this as a real challenge across almost every PIM today, where if you don't have some kind of pre-PIM software through your implementation partner, you're oftentimes left managing spreadsheets. Maybe your implementation partner is even just using spreadsheets. And so we think this is a real challenge that is fairly pervasive in the market today, is that before you get into your PIM, you're stuck in this world of spreadsheet maintenance that is it's not completely clear what you're working on. It's not completely clear what you're reviewing and approving, or even how to go about doing it. And that's one of the reasons that we've built a purpose-built software over the years that we use to help with this kind of onboarding.
So let's talk about that new world, that application that may address that issue of a bunch of spreadsheets in an organization.
Yeah. So you may still, on the left-hand side here, still be dealing with a bunch of spreadsheets. So you may be getting spreadsheets or CSV files or out of your ERP or from your supplier. So we're not going to be able to necessarily fix that. So you kind of start with spreadsheets as your inputs. But we typically load those spreadsheets or those pieces of data into what we call a pre-PIM environment. And that is a purpose-built. It's kind of like a PIM, but it's a pre-PIM. So it doesn't do. We'll see in a future slide like what a pre-PIM does relative to a PIM, but it's a product information management environment. But it's super flexible. It's really easy to load data. It's really easy to change the data model in the middle of the project. It's really easy to change the product information. So you can make sweeping changes that you might never want to make in a PIM. It's really good at designing taxonomy, building data quality rules and enforcing those data quality rules as we're building them. And so it's really good at building data, normalizing data, and getting data ready for that PIM load. And another thing that it's good at is providing an environment, an intuitive environment, in which the key stakeholders and subject matter experts can review and approve content before it's loaded to PIM. One more thing I'll mention is that within the pre-PIM environment, we often have the ability to see a preview of what this data might look like on for instance, a website or a mobile application. So instead of having to wait for the data to get loaded to PIM and then wait for the PIM implementation provider to figure out how to exchange data downstream, which oftentimes can take a really long time before you're actually seeing the data in a test site. We can get there in a modified version of the display layer very quickly and in real time from our pre-PIM environment. So we can understand what it's going to look like all the way downstream while we're building our data.
Okay, so now we're sort of drawing a line between the pre-PIM and the PIM. And now maybe here's a good representation of, what each application is or isn't good for. So I'll let you talk more on this, Eli, as well.
Yeah, this is an important one because a pre-PIM is different than a PIM. There's a lot of things that pre-PIMs are not good at. But there are some things that they excel at that maybe are weak spots for many of the PIMs out there. So first is data model design. So being able to build out a 1, a 2, or a 3-tier data model and make changes to that as we're building out pilot data and reviewing with stakeholders. So we can make changes to the data model and build the data model in real time. That's often very difficult to do in PIM. PIM pretty much wants you to make these decisions in advance of setting up the PIM environment. So it's a real flexible model for changes, early changes to the data model as we're still building out the design. Second is taxonomy design. This is a really big one. And EIS, of course, is our specialists in taxonomy design, whether it's master attribution hierarchy or an e-commerce hierarchy design. Pre-PIMs are particularly good at designing taxonomies, especially those early stages of taxonomy where there's lots of changes taking place. You might not want to be copying and pasting branches of the taxonomy in your PIM, but in the pre-PIM environment, you might do that quite a bit, especially in the early phases of the design. You might be building alternate designs and multiple taxonomies where you're trying out different ideas. The pre-PIM is really good for that. And pre-PIM is also really good for tracking open issues on taxonomy design and reviewing with stakeholders while the design is still changing very quickly. It's also good at classifying SKUs to the taxonomy, sometimes using auto classification. Business stakeholder engagement is a real strength of pre-PIM. So we have intuitive interfaces and exports that make it easy for stakeholders to review and approve content before it's loaded to PIM and know what they're reviewing and approving. Data remediation, a lot of that is taking place in pre-PIM. So this is normalizing. It's not just designing a taxonomy and designing attribute schemes, but it's normalizing all the content, whether it's descriptions, feature copy and bullets, or attribute values. We're very often normalizing this content before it gets into PIM. Not that PIM can't do these things well once it's stood up, but it's a lot easier to do outside of PIM when you're doing, when you're making, hundreds of thousands of changes to attribute values and things like that. Next is design metrics. So some PIMs are pretty good at this, or better than others. Some have almost nothing. But looking at design metrics. So how deep is my taxonomy? Where do I have issues where I have structural issues with my hierarchy? Where do I have, how many attributes do I have per category? What are my fill rates for the attributes that I have? Where are my descriptions violating style guidelines? Being able to look at all these metrics and see them in real time so that we can spot opportunities and edge cases where we need to make corrections. Pre-PIM really good with that. PIM maybe not so good, especially without customization. Controlled vocabulary, I'll group controlled vocabulary and style guidelines. So this is setting up a preferred term dictionary that might inform data quality rules and may also be leveraged by search applications. In our pre-PIM environment, we build this out as we're building the data, and we're checking these controlled vocabularies and style guidelines against the content, and we're kind of building up both at the same time. Very often, we don't even have a place to put this in a PIM. So a lot of the PIMs out there, they don't really have a way to manage a control, or don't have a good way to manage a controlled vocabulary, or they don't really have a good way to manage style guidelines such that the guidelines are actually being checked against the content. So pre-PIM, really good place to build up your controlled vocabulary and your style guidelines as you're building your content. And then very often, we're not even sending that data into the PIM. We'd love to. Some of the PIMs can handle this content, so we build it up in the pre-PIM and then we load it to PIM as data quality rules. But very often we have to find another place to manage this when we actually do implement the PIM, because the PIM sometimes can't handle effectively style guidelines and vocabulary. So these are all the things that pre-PIM is good at. And PIM, maybe, we're oftentimes covering what are gaps in many of the PIM platforms. But pre-PIM is also not good at a lot of things. There's a reason why it's a pre-PIM and not a PIM. So pre-PIMs are not necessarily very good at managing master data and syndicating that data downstream. So a pre-PIM isn't really meant to stand at the center of an enterprise and have hundreds of users operating in different workflows in different ways, and keeping all that data synced and integrated with downstream channels. That's not something pre-PIM is good at, and that's something that PIMs can be very good at. Day-to-day onboarding and supplier portals, that's not something that we really have in a pre-PIM so much. But these are things that PIMs can really excel at. So day-to-day operations of adding SKUs and the ability to stand up a supplier portal so that your suppliers can get in there and add content directly to the PIM. Integrating upstream, so integrating with ERP. This is something that PIMs are very good at, some better than others. It's something that we don't do much with the pre-PIM. We're tending to get load files out of ERP and then load them into our design environment. So not a lot of integrations going on there like you would expect in a real PIM. DAM integrations is something that is key and crucial, and PIMs tend to excel with. Sometimes they even have DAMs kind of integrated into the PIM. Not something that is a particular strength of pre-PIM. We have DAM content in pre-PIM that we may be reviewing the quality of the images, but that's about it. There's not a lot of DAM functionality sometimes in a pre-PIM. And lastly, workflow and permissions. So in a pre-PIM design environment, you have a small team of designers that are working on this content, but it's nothing like the number of users that you might have in a commercial PIM that are set up with permissions and set up with workflows. The workflows and permissions in a pre-PIM are much simpler than what you would find in a PIM. So you can't use a pre-PIM as a PIM. It doesn't really, they might seem like they both have a lot of the similar functionality, and there is a lot of overlap, but they're kind of performing two very specific functions.
So hopefully a good delineation for folks on this webinar about the differences between the two systems. I come back to something you said, Eli, about wholesale changes. Some of my customers that have PIM may be going through an acquisition, as an example. So they're acquiring just vast amounts of data, and they have some hesitancy to just immediately start working on that, in the PIM environment itself. So thinking about an alternative route in, that's maybe a better safe passageway, and one that you have more confidence and checks and balances in place, is a good route.
That's a good call out. I think, when you think about adding, especially if you already have your PIM stood up and you're already working within PIM, if you're adding one product or one SKU, you do that in PIM. If you just had an acquisition, though, maybe you're adding 50,000 SKUs that might have a subtle overlap with your existing products in your PIM. That's where we see some of our clients kind of backing data out of PIM and analyzing using a pre-PIM environment. So when you have a critical mass of new SKUs or products or content that you're looking to load to PIM, sometimes it's easier to take it into another environment and assess and design and normalize the content before you load it to PIM.
So we kind of spoke to some of this already, I feel like, because I think there's probably, we think about, you know, data and what what PIM really excels at, and why can't I just do everything in PIM? Well, let's stay with that theme and talk about, what it does and doesn't do well.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good question. It's like, well, why do I need a PIM for my PIM? A pre-PIM for my PIM? Can't I just want to use the PIM? And there's some reasons why that typically doesn't work. Is that we don't see a lot of our clients just taking legacy data and loading it to PIM directly with no changes, and then kind of sorting everything out in the PIM environment. And these are some of the reasons. First, an actual PIM environment needs to be set up. Sometimes that doesn't exist on day one. It might take months to have the PIM actually stood up. You might see a demo environment before they sell it to you, of course, but they're not. By the time your environment is actually operational and stood up, it might take a while, depending on the PIM. And part of the reason is that key design decisions need to be made before deployment. Just a classic one is a 1-tier versus a 2-tier data model. Are you going to just have a bunch of SKUs, or are you going to have a base variant, or are you going to have a base variant SKU? We even see 3-tier models. So these kind of decisions have to be made. How many hierarchies are you going to set up? How are they going to link together? How are items going to flow from one hierarchy to another? A lot of these decisions have to be made in advance before the PIM environment is stood up, and that can take time, valuable time. Data models are not easily changed in PIM, so we usually want to kind of make some final decisions before we set up environments. So if you start making changes, big changes to the data model in the PIM, you usually want to have those decisions made before you stand up the PIM. Governance challenges, so help text, definitions for things, style guidelines, controlled vocabulary. Depending on the PIM, some of these features and functionalities, surprisingly, are still missing. In fact, for most PIMs, you're not able to do all of these things right out of the box, which is surprising to people, but most of our PIM users out there are missing at least something here. They're having trouble maintaining definitions or help text or style guidelines or controlled vocabulary, and then actually having those have teeth and being applied to the content and recognizing violations. Performance issues when making large scale changes. It might not be fair to call these performance issues, but they are some of them are intentional. So in a PIM, you might want to have you might have a lot of checks and balances in place that keep people from making broad sweeping changes to the data. You might not want people to be able to delete, all 50,000 items in the adhesives category in one move. You might not want to allow people to do find replaces that would make really big sweeping changes across the PIM. And then sometimes there are real performance issues where screens in PIM, because they are standing at the center of an enterprise, actively maintaining master data, things can be a little bit slow. It might be a little bit slower to get an export. Might be a little slower to open up a tab that has all 10,000 items in it from a given category. It might be a little slower to search for something across the entire PIM and get the results back. Once again, it depends on the PIM, but PIMs are not known for their speed always. A lot of our clients are having trouble with speed, and that impedes workflow, and it makes design a lot slower. And then data quality reporting and analytics, especially out of the box. Some PIMs are better than others, but setting up data quality reports, setting up rules, and then actually having those rules identify violations and having workflow around those violations is not something PIMs are always great with, especially right out of the box. So there are some PIMs out there that are better than others and do some of these things pretty well. But it's not very common for us to see our customers just loading whatever they have into PIM and then kind of sorting it out in PIM. A lot of times they're designing and they're normalizing as the PIM is getting ready to receive the initial load of master content.
Yeah, that last bullet always sticks with me. I think about how just imperative it is to understand what you have in hand and where the gaps are, and having a tool that can you can really rely on to give you your North Star to go remediate data, I think is really, really important here. All right, so now we get to the spreadsheets, right? We keep, I feel like we're giving spreadsheets a bad name, but that we know that's not the case. In my view, spreadsheets are the first PIM on earth, right? So there's still going to be value there, but how can we minimize our dependency on them, I think, is what we're all trying to get to. So what are your thoughts on that, Eli?
Yeah, so I mean, can't I use spreadsheet? Yeah, you can use spreadsheets. In fact, that might still be the dominant methodology for loading data to PIM today, although it is changing. So you can use spreadsheets, but there's reasons why you might not want to, especially if you're making more complex design choices and you're working on normalizing content. If you're merging content from multiple legacy systems or multiple sources prior to loading to PIM, it becomes even more difficult to use spreadsheets. So if you, like I said earlier, if it's not just one spreadsheet, there's not just one spreadsheet with your items in it that you load to PIM. There's a spreadsheet for your items. There might be a spreadsheet for their parent products. There may be a spreadsheet for the categories in your hierarchy. You might have multiple hierarchies. We have clients that have 5 different hierarchies for different regions and for different channels and for master attribution versus e-commerce. So sometimes you have multiple different hierarchies that these items, and then you have all the classifications from the items to the different hierarchies. You then have all of the attributes associated. So you have attribute spreadsheets, and you have category specific attribute spreadsheets and a global attribute spreadsheet. Then you have a spreadsheet where all the attribute values for all the items are contained, and you have you can do it, but we've seen some pretty brutal scenarios over the years where this pre-PIM spreadsheet management kind of spirals out of control and kind of ends in, well, just load it, approve this and load it. Well, I don't know what I'm approving. I don't really know that these are the attributes that I want. Well, you got to approve it and load it because we got to hit the implementation date here. So we want to be careful. The spreadsheets can really be complicated and difficult to reconcile. It's hard to track issues and versions in spreadsheets. That's another thing. So how are you tracking issues on all of these different entities that you're managing that are related to each other in different ways and changing all the time? It's hard to sync separate work streams. So if you've got one team that's working on the hierarchy design for e-commerce, another team that's working on the hierarchy design for master attribution, another team that's working on building out the optimal attributes for each category, it can be really hard to keep these teams synced if they're relying on spreadsheets. It's notoriously difficult to manage taxonomy in spreadsheets, just the hierarchical nature of the categories and how they fit together. Anybody who's tried to work with taxonomy development in Excel knows what we're talking about there, but it's notoriously difficult to manage taxonomies in spreadsheets. And ultimately what happens is you end up spending more time managing the spreadsheets and less time designing, because sometimes your key resources are needed to manage these super complex spreadsheet environments when really they should be making the crucial decisions about the data model and the data design.
Very good. So that brings us to our last poll. We're going to wake everybody's brains up again. And I'll read the question. What are your challenges around onboarding in PIM? And this assumes you kind of have a PIM, but if you don't have a PIM, maybe you have some other system, some other database. It could be homegrown or whatever the case may be. You can think of the question in that vein as well. Any guesses here, Eli? Who's your winner?
I'll go with using too many spreadsheets, possibly something else.
I'm going to say number 2, unable to track issues effectively. A couple more seconds for folks. And let's see what the winner is. Looks like the winner is difficulty enforcing style guides and standards. Okay. Oh, it's a tie with data quality metrics. Very good. So some real challenges out there with users in systems and data. And that's, well, quite frankly, that's the way it should be as we're trying to get better at all this stuff, right? So let's advance the program. And I think we're going to move into the application itself, which is, I think what we're all waiting for, Eli, is, well, tell me what the pre-PIM is going to, we've said what it can do a little bit, but here's the why, and then we'll get into some use cases so folks can kind of come away with something a little more tangible.
Yep. So why use a Pre-PIM Accelerator, which we are going to share a little more with you in a couple slides. But the first is it reduces the complexity of the design process. And as we said earlier, it allows us to focus on design and focus less on maintaining relationships between all the entities that we're designing. It enables experimentation and iteration. So when we have a purpose-built application, it's easy to go backwards. It's easy to rewind. It's easy to break off and have two competing designs that we're working on simultaneously and kind of playing around with a couple different ideas. It's easy to experiment and fail and recover, which is any design process has a lot of that, especially at the beginning. So it's good for that as we're finding what the right design is, finding what the right data model is, and maybe finding the right taxonomy, the right hierarchy, or the right attribute schemes. It has integrated governance and data quality rules so that we can build those up as we are building the data itself. So that's style guidelines around the hierarchy, around the attributes, around the attribute values, and controlled vocabulary around what terms we're looking to use. We can also track issues and document issues and resolve issues in working sessions right there in the application. You could use Jira, but Jira isn't connected to any of your data. So when you're looking at your hierarchy in one place, to have to go over to the Jira board and find the issue with that, category in the hierarchy or with that product can be really confusing and not very efficient. So there are ways to track issues, of course, other than in the application, but having the issues right there so that you can see the issues with the products, the items, the attributes, and the categories as you're working on them is really beneficial for a designer. And then also being able to monitor design and structural metrics and also get a preview of what the data is going to look like on the front end while you're designing. So I can, at any time, I can go over and look at how many items I have per category. I can look at the lengths of my labels. I can look at where I have revenue buried in the hierarchy. I can look at places where revenue is really concentrated in one child category in my hierarchy. I can look at where my descriptions are too long or too short. I can look at where I have too many bullets or not enough feature bullets, where I have images or where I don't have images, the fill rates of my attributes. Being able to see this kind of information in real time while you're designing is crucial. It's if you wait till the end and wait till the data gets into PIM, first of all, some of the PIMs won't even be able to provide you these metrics. And even if they do, it's too late. It might be too late. You may have missed a real opportunity if you wait until you get into PIM to see some of these metrics.
Okay, so this will transition us to the application itself. We've been working with an application called WorkMap Commerce, and it does much of what Eli's already described, but now we'll give you some sort of deeper insights. And Eli, I like how you're using the term design, product data design. I think that's a good way for folks to think about product data and being flexible and getting out of this world of just rows and columns, right? So just a tip of the cap there, because I like that phrase, product data design.
Design is different than maintenance, and you do start with a design phase, and then you eventually make your way into maintenance within the PIM. But what are the use cases for pre-PIM software? Well, onboarding to PIM, as we've talked about, data quality and remediation of data quality prior to loading to PIM. We can auto-classify SKUs to products. We can auto-classify products to categories. Data quality benchmarking. So understanding what our data quality metrics are at each stage within the implementation cycle. Building those data quality rules and controlled vocabulary while you're building and normalizing the content. Being able to preview, if we need to be able to preview what the design looks like and how it's going to look from a UX perspective prior to even loading the data to PIM, it's good for that. Designing taxonomy, we've talked about. Base variant design, this is really important for many of our customers these days. Being able to review data sourcing. So you sent 50,000 SKUs out to an offshore vendor to fill in descriptions and attribute values and images, and now you've gotten those files back from your sourcing provider, and you're looking to QA them and integrate them before you load them to PIM. That's something that the Pre-PIM software is good at. And then another key use case is description optimization. So optimizing short descriptions, long descriptions, feature copy, especially at scale.
Okay, so now you're starting to see some screenshots of what the application looks like. Why don't you talk about each of these use cases, Eli?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're not going to do a demo here live on the call, but we've got some screenshots that we're going to walk through. And they're semi-informative as we go. So the first is the idea of design iteration before we implement into PIM, and that's especially important for designing hierarchies. So a lot of times at the beginning of the PIM implementation journey, we don't even know the data model we're not certain of the data model for hierarchies. So how many hierarchies are there going to be? How are they going to link together? Where are where are key pieces of metadata going to be managed in the ecosystem? And so iterating on these designs prior to loading to PIM can be really advantageous. These are things like aligning regional and channel hierarchies with a master hierarchy, maybe where we're maintaining master classification and attribution. And then also reviewing and approving with stakeholders before we load to PIM. So in some cases, building an enterprise taxonomy is almost as much of a political act as it is an act of design. It's both. And most of our customers are looking to get key stakeholders to review and approve these hierarchies, these key taxonomies before they go into the PIM. And a pre-PIM is a really good place to do that. It's really flexible so that we can make changes, we can track open issues and tie them to the stakeholders and iterate on the design until we can get something that's approved by all stakeholders. The best designs are those that are challenged by the stakeholders. Next is data quality and remediation. So this is really, you could just take all your legacy content and load it to PIM, and then we'll use the PIM to clean up the content. We see that approach sometimes. It sometimes doesn't work very well. It depends on how much remediation your content requires. But a lot of our customers are looking to improve data quality, normalize and remediate data quality issues prior to PIM load. And the pre-PIM is a good place to do that. Just on the screenshot here, we have examples: duct wrap and duct wrapping, mat and matting, plenum wrap and plenum wrapping. These are the kinds of normalization issues that we see, especially when we're merging multiple sources of content together. And pre-PIM is a good place to smooth all of this out. And as we said earlier, not just to smooth out these normalization issues, but also to document data quality rules or style guidelines so that we can keep these in line over time. So it's not just about normalizing on duct wrapping or duct wrap, or maybe there's some synonyms out there for the same term, but also recording a preferred terminology that we can leverage over time to make sure this stays aligned in the future. Yeah, I think we covered everything there.
Yeah, I feel like we did there. And just to support, the very basics of why this matters in a business. And, we always come back to, it's about finding what you're looking for, findability. And that's what's on the horizon here when we think about designing product data. Tell us about this collaborative design here, Eli.
Yeah, so a lot of a big part of the design process is reviewing the design with stakeholders and getting different perspectives and documenting open issues and performing secondary research to determine what the options are and what the best option is moving forward. So on a typical design or PIM implementation project, we're documenting hundreds of issues. And some of those issues are issues about an item. They may be issues about a category. They may be issues about an attribute value, or issues about a preferred terminology. And being able to document all of this and track it in line with the content is really important. So we can bring together, stakeholders from IT, stakeholders from marketing, stakeholders from product management. They're all going to have different perspectives, and they're all going to be providing feedback on from different vectors, and being able to control that and maintain it in one central location, but then also being able to see it, in line with the content that it's addressing is super important, and makes the review and approval process more intuitive and more impactful for our clients. Yeah, you can do some of that in Jira boards, but that can sometimes be really inefficient to think that you're gonna, track all these issues for a rapidly evolving set of product information in a Jira board. It just doesn't work very well. Jira boards are better for tracking, development issues and kind of IT issues, and maybe not so good at tracking product information issues. Auto classification, sometimes this actually isn't that impactful because we don't need to auto classify. We might already have all of our SKUs classified to a legacy hierarchy, and so it sometimes is not that big of a factor in our projects. Other projects, this is a huge labor saver. So it really depends on the state of the information and how many SKUs we need to classify. But one of the places, it's not just auto classifying SKUs to categories, which is what people I think of initially, but it's also about auto classifying SKUs to their products, or what we'd sometimes call base variants. So classifying the variants to the bases. A lot more work sometimes goes into that than it does classifying SKUs to categories. So the ability to auto classify entities to parent entities can save time and create efficiencies. It's also can be really helpful in identifying bad design or misclassifications. So the auto classifier can take a SKU that's not classified at all and find what product it might belong to or what category it might belong to, but it can also take a SKU that has already been classified to a product or a category, and it can assess whether there are other products or other categories that this should be classified to based on its content. So it can be good for classifying SKUs from kind of a starting point, and it can also be good for identifying potential reclassifications, which is helpful in identifying misclassifications. I think this is what people, at least on this call, said one of the things they said they were struggling with the most is the ability to see real-time analytics and metrics. This is a super simple metric. This is just the length of the category names. And so this is actually a pretty good design here where it goes from, it looks like about 4 characters to about 35 characters. But it's being able, there's a lot of different metrics that we want to see. And so it's everything from the lengths of labels to the counts of entities, to the fill rates of attributes, to whether things are buried or not, and whether the attributes in left navigation provide the ability to navigate down to SKUs completely. And then also a lot of custom metrics are getting built out based on what's important to our customers and maybe some of their unique requirements. So we usually have 50 to 100 metrics that we're monitoring in real time as we're building out these hierarchies. And we can take snapshots and provide benchmarking. That's important too, but maybe what's even more important is the ability for the designers to have access to these reports. And it's not just charts and graphs. Sometimes there's tables backing all of these up as well, so that we can see the actual categories at the edges of these distributions. Mm-hmm. So having these kinds of metrics and analytics at our fingertips while we're designing is just really, really beneficial when you're a designer.
Yeah, I would agree. I think providing visuals back to a team like this can really help them assess if they're well balanced or not in certain key areas of their product data. And that brings us to governance, which is never an easy one for a business. It sounds like it's such a big, weighty subject matter, but there are ways to build in good practices.
Yeah, so I think 2 of the keys that are on the screen right here are controlled vocabulary or preferred terminology, and then more general style guidelines. So what we see on the screen here are some preferred terms. This is just a small sample. Most of our clients are managing thousands of preferred terms. And when you set up preferred terms, there's two things that you want to do with them. Number one, you want to check the non-preferred terms against the content you're building. So we can see where the violations are and fix those violations. So it's about actually maintaining the content and aligning the content with the terminology. And then the other thing that we tend to do with these is feed the non-preferred terms and their links to the preferred terms into the search platform. So all of these non-preferred terms will be able to be used as search terms in search applications. So there's kind of two uses for this non-preferred terminology, and there's some extra controls that we're showing here. There is some additional complexity here and customizations that sometimes occur with this kind of content, but you're ultimately checking non-preferred terms against the content, and then you're leveraging non-preferred terms in search technology. Style guidelines are a little bit different. They're less about specific terms, and style guidelines might be more about data quality rules. So it might be something like, a category label should not be more than 30 characters, or there should be no double spaces in attribute names. And once again, you might have hundreds of these style guidelines, and it's the same concept. You're looking to document the style guidelines in clear language and provide examples. But then maybe more importantly, you're looking to check those style guidelines against the content so that we can resolve the violations. When people talk about standing up a governance program, a lot of times the focus is on, what does the team look like? What's the RACI diagram? Do I have a charter document? How often do we meet? What are the high-level metrics that we are going to track? Those are all really important, and those are all key components of a governance program. But when you think about the blocking and tackling, like, these can be really key components. So having a preferred term dictionary that's being checked against the content, having style guidelines that have been ratified and are being checked against the content, this is where a lot of the blocking and tackling of a governance program takes place.
So I guess this is a simple view of what your data how it might be organized and displayed on a website, as an example.
Yeah, so the nice thing about preview mode, and of course we can customize this to look as much like our future state website as we want to. This is not customized at all, what we're looking at right now, but it allows us to see what's type ahead going to look like. What is it going to look like to interact with type ahead with the categories and the items that we're building? What is it going to look like to navigate through this hierarchy? What are the product listing pages going to look like? What is left navigation going to look like and feel like? We can test this ultimately in real time and toggle over and see a mock-up of a front-end design while we're still building the data before it's even gotten into PIM yet. And for those of you who have struggled with something like this, this is narrowing the time where you're able to see what it's going to look like on the front end, sometimes by months. By the time the PIM actually figures out how to get the data stood up, actually figures out how to become operational, and then actually figures out how to send the data downstream to a test environment, your e-commerce platform, you could be talking about months. Whereas here, we can see it before we've even loaded the data to PIM. We're able to get a preview of what this is going to look like on the front end.
Very cool. Now, if I could only advance this slide, here we go. Okay, so that concludes the word map commerce representation, if you will. We thought what we'd do is, before we get into the Q&A, I think we have some time to do that still. If you're interested in sort of jumping in the pool and understanding what the strengths and weaknesses of your own product data is, we can talk about a readiness assessment with one of our consultants. We can also take your data and show it represented in the word map commerce itself. So two options there that we can help you with to advance the discussion in your business. So that brings us to the Q&A, and there were some questions that came in, and I think we can tackle them with the 5 minutes we have left. Let me look at my other screen here. Eli, it looks like someone wants to know if there are any commercial PIMs on the market that includes something like word map, like some type of accelerator already built in. Have you seen anything like that or similar?
No, I think you'll find some of these at your I would say it's hit or miss when you're looking at PIM implementation providers. So some of them are going to have this kind of an application and some are not. When we look at the PIMs, there might be something out there that I'm not aware of yet, but when I think of tools that are provided by the leading PIMs, please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but if there is something out there, I haven't seen it yet. There might be some things that kind of do some of these things, but I haven't seen anything that does the complete package. You usually have to actually get your data into PIM before you can do most of these things.
Yeah, in my experience, I've seen some mapping utilities, but it still requires a lot of heavy spreadsheet activity in advance of. So I think that's consistent with what I've seen. Another question here: well, does word map integrate with any commercial PIMs?
Yeah, we've integrated with some e-commerce platforms and some PIMs. We've exchanged data with, I think, every PIM. So, I think I'm going to draw a distinction between having exports that are able to be loaded hands-free. I don't call that an integration, but so we've had hands-free exports from WordMap Commerce that go straight into PIM. In terms of integrations, I think some of the e-commerce applications we've integrated with, and some PIMs we've integrated with, and others we haven't.
Okay. Here's another one that's it's interesting. This one came in earlier. Do some companies have product management, but not a formal PIM? Is the question. So I would answer that as yes. I think that exists in a lot of places. I think there's a lot of custom databases out there that manage these processes, and companies in many cases are wed to them because it adheres to some strict business rules and niche qualities about their business. How would you respond to that, Eli?
I think there's a lot of companies out there that are still operating without a formal PIM and managing product information. Maybe they're using a catalog management platform that could still be publishing print catalogs and using that kind of technology. They might be using spreadsheets or a homegrown database. And then remember that many of the market leaders in product, I'm thinking Amazon, McMaster-Carr, Grainger, some of the most respected names in managing product information. They're using homegrown PIMs. They probably wouldn't allow themselves to be constrained by a commercial PIM, and that's partly due to their size and the complexity of what they're trying to do with product information. So would they call that what they have a PIM? Maybe. So I think in terms of what's a formal PIM, there's still a lot of companies managing data outside of what would be a formal commercial PIM.
Time for one more, then we're going to wrap up. What ROI metrics would you use to justify a pre-PIM?
Yeah, I think time to implementation would be one, and I think also the ability to understand data quality metrics prior to loading to PIM. So the ability to achieve data quality targets prior to loading to PIM. Those would be the ROI metrics. So if you have ROI around things like fill rate or data completeness or image completeness, if you know the ROI of those metrics, a pre-PIM will help you achieve those metrics prior to loading to PIM. So quicker time to achieve data quality metrics.
And I'll add to that, get your PIM implementation right the first time. It's an expensive proposition, and what you don't want to get into a situation where you have to pause and rewind and sort of do it all over again. So I would add to that. There's a lot of cost involved. Well, I think that brings us to the close here. I hope we don't go too far over. We'll share this deck and the recording to all that attended. Here's a little note about some additional resources that you might find of value to you. We also have a podcast about artificial intelligence led by our own Seth Earley that you may want to listen in on. It's a little plug there. We thank all of you for your generosity in attending this 1 hour session with Eli and I. Have a great day.